listeners who are tuning into Curating Invisibilities podcast. Here's Eunyoung. I will be hosting this podcast and actually be the one who will mostly do the talking on this podcast. This is meant to be one of the post-productions of the festival called Curating Invisibilities, as many of you already know. Curating Invisibilities is an on and offline festival for post-colonial perspectives on culture in the rural areas, which took place at Arbeit Center with Hele Medienwerkstatt. There were 10 wonderful people in the curatorial team and as speakers. Clarissa, Fayo, Eric, Ajaini, Hoitzone, Rosa Murtha, and Isaiah, Naomi, Mohammed, and Alexis, who built this whole festival collaboratively and discursively throughout a long period of time. I could not follow the whole process of making, since I joined the festival team later for this podcast. However, from what I heard, the reflection and efforts of each member and of the whole team runs deep and for long. Actually, I feel that I still need more time for the reflection for myself to let what was shared in the festival sink in. Well, for now, I'm not here to represent the team, but rather I wish to add some of my humble thoughts for the post-production of the festival. I hope this could sound interesting to anyone who wishes to be peeping in to the Arbeit Center in the middle of a sweet town called Hüll in northern Germany. There will be a video documentation of the on-site festival coming on, filmed by David Sinkemat. You can also check this out through the media channels of Hele Medienwerkstatt and check out the real talk, performance and ritual which happened on site. First thing first, I would like to show my gratitude to everyone who creatively and reflectively worked together for this meaningful festival by asking questions and pondering upon some important matters on the post-colonial perspectives on culture in the rural area. So I said some important matters on the post-colonial perspectives on culture in the rural area. I could imagine that the focal point on rurality could be refreshing for some people who are familiar with academic post-colonial discourses. For myself, for me, it was the first time to take part in a discussion about post-colonialism and rurality. It was also the first time to be in a rural setting for a discussion about post-colonialism. One thing is just that most of the settings that I went where the post-colonial discourse is shared were mostly in a city, like at the convention center, universities, or museums, where you can find highly sophisticated discussions, debates, and theories, in a white room with whiteboard or a beam projector casting keynote slides on the wall. And everyone just gathered for the event, and everyone gets dispersed. Of course, I do not know all the settings that post-colonial discourse is shared. That from my experience, from a distance, you might not distinguish if the writers and academics, the participants of the event, are talking about a new taxation policy or about post-colonialism. It is oftentimes not meant to exclude rurality from the discourse. However, there are invisible filters working in these settings which swiftly make some things invisible. Some things that don't concern bigger institution, bigger interest, and bigger agenda get lost during the selection of these conferences, symposiums, and exhibitions. For some of these events, rural areas are too far away, and rurality may seem to be a less urgent thing to discuss in their limited period of time. They have more timely, more trendy topics to discuss. However, this unwitting exclusion of rural areas in the discourse, for me at least, implicates one thing: homogeneity. When I think about this matter, there are so many layers that I have to wrap my brain to sort out. What is rural area? What is rurality? Rural, adjective defined by Merriam-Webster in the dictionary, means, quote unquote, of or relating to the country, countryside, country people or life, or agriculture. Collins' dictionary says, rural means having features which are typical of areas that are far away from large towns or cities. Oxford Learner's Dictionary says, connected with or like the countryside. I know I didn't need to look up 3 dictionaries to check out the literal definition, but those definitions alone really didn't make me understand what it is about rural areas. Here's what I tried to illustrate: rurality and rural areas. There are some places that remain less urbanized. Things trickle down and trickle in slowly and gradually to rural areas. Therefore, life is rather slower and rather conservative. Life is more bound to changes of season, weather, and the sun, compared to the life in a city. Natural cycle and some consistent practices are very much more prominent to people who cultivate land and follow the rhythm of season and daylight. One writer once wrote, people who own a garden tend to be more conservative. I think he meant politically in this case, because their days and months are long bound to the very old rules of nature that they cannot or they dare not resist, or simply they don't want to resist. They like doing it in old ways. Even if this premise is wrong, it is hard to deny that the realities of rural area are not like that of the cities. Of course, colonialism worked and still works in a different way in the rural area than in the urban area. Actually, I wonder if it's possible to agree on a certain type of manifestation of colonialism, which is why it is important to share our experiences, which are different yet relatable. These experiences to understand how the bigger wheel of colonialism unfolds to each person, to each family, and to each community. I believe it's not only the case of colonialism. Also, systemic heteronormativity and patriarchy would unfold differently to each individual and to each town. However, when we vaguely and theoretically talk about post-colonial realities without situating them with certain localities, we assume homogeneous unfolding of the system and of the colonialism. For me, one interesting thing about rural areas is that they preserve old things compared to the urban areas. Old buildings, old customs, old neighbors, and so on. I remember my good friend Eva Bush mentioning her hometown in a rural area and how the whole town kind of benefited from someone's success or someone's business during the colonial time. The wealth earned abroad, the wealth earned by a colonizer like this was inherited to next generations. For someone, this land and establishments might not be more than something that they inherited and possessed. If you ask me why anyone should care about how their ancestors or great-grandparents earned enough money to buy those lands and houses and horses that you ride, then I would answer, because there is more to it than it meets the eye. Well, if I were to expand this thought, the same goes to the current political and economic hegemony and the beneficiaries. Let's think, who has the money and the infrastructure to host symposiums, conferences, and exhibitions for the post-colonial reflection and perspectives? How much more time do we need to avoid decolonization process in its discourse being appropriated by the colonizer's tokenism? To talk a little bit about my place of birth, South Korea. In Korea, before the independence and the foundation of republic in the 1940s, a big portion of the land which was previously cultivated by chosen people, the pre-republic Korean, was unjustly taken by Japanese people who lived in Korea for business or for political reasons. There were numerous ways to do so, ranging from using brutal military force to changing the land law for Japanese business owners in one night. It's not just their business or their colonial policies were unjust, but actually them being there, their wealthy existence was unjust to the people. Then what happened to those lands after the independence? Were they given back to the previous owner? You can imagine the new landowners of the Republic are not really the people who previously owned or cultivated the land, but the Korean people who mostly assisted the colonial Japanese government to successfully colonize and rule Korean peninsula. The independence of Korea was gained by the loss of Imperial Japan in the Second World War, and the power was just transferred. That power was just transferred onto a new hegemony. The hegemony is actually not renewed. No, it was actually just renewed. The status quo was never effectively overthrown since the independence, and namely, the post-colonial era of Korea still carries the weight and the hegemony of the colonization. To go on about rurality, if you think about how many people actually left and leave their town of birth to settle down in cities, it is somewhat weird not to talk about rural areas. How can we deny that industrialization and development was one of the biggest pretexts of colonialism that flung the door open and shoved the people away from their own land? Cities and urbanism were built upon the carcass of lost reality. Now we pretend that everything is made and produced in cities and factories, and reality is something peripheral. However, when I think about it, city was not built without colonialism. They were built on the carcass of reality. And it might have even changed reality as well. No, it changed the reality as well. And now, as a 27-year-old individual from an urban upbringing, I cannot leave the city, nor really live in a city. I recently watched a reportage about living conditions, the dwellings of London. You live under the staircase and you pay, more than several hundred euros per month. When I was going to a Western European university, there were so many students who couldn't find a place to live, no matter how much they were willing to pay. Even after the semester has started. So even after the semester has started, a few lived in a tent for weeks or hostels until they could find any place to live in. Many got scammed, and one of my friends actually had to run away from the landlord who was almost being violent to her. So for many, especially for the youth and social minorities, living in a city means that they live in somebody else's property with endless precariousness and financial and emotional burden. Recently I moved back to Seoul from Germany. So I'm no longer in Western Europe, but in my place of birth. However, I did not have any furniture nor belongings here, because simply I didn't have a place to keep all the things while I was gone. What I had kept and collected was given and thrown away long time ago before leaving for Germany, and I came back with one suitcase and a backpack. There was no house or a place remaining that I could comfortably return to. It took more than 3 months before I could start moving into a new place from my friend's small room that I crashed at. The deposit I pay for a new flat is 100 times of its monthly rent, which I could not prepare without getting a loan. I really wanted to move out from Seoul. However, I didn't have money to make my living in the rural area. I do not have a car to commute to cities, nor do I own a land or skills to farm. There is no job opportunity there for me. I have a family to take care of who lives in Seoul. Living in a city makes me feel that I do not have ownership over wherever I live and go. Really no ownership over the land below my feet. I can say that I am from Seoul, but I don't know if I can call anything mine in Seoul. Therefore, rurality has been something that I have missed in nostalgia and envy for. I know, grass is greener on the other side. Actually, I just heard about realities of rural life from others and how suffocating it could be if you're not considered to be part of the community. Lack of infrastructure and exclusive communities. that shut you out. That shut you out. Maybe a neighbor that would remember your birthday and take care of your plants, and your dog might only sound sweet in a city dweller's dream, like me. I hope I'm not generalizing my feeling or experience to describe the realities of city life. However, I think there is a point of sharing my own experience for its own sake, but also to let people who are listening to this podcast understand there are some things relatable to your own experience. There are some things that I might feel envious of. These are the other sides of a bigger phenomenon. Like a coin. I might be miles and miles apart from where you're listening to this right now, but these things are happening in the cities, or actually in any part of the world that has been gentrified and urbanized. And I think we do share somehow the exigency of post-colonial life. Oh, I got really thirsty. I blubbered too much about the reality and my city life, right? I just want to lastly say that the fact the festival took place at Arbeit Center in Hul itself is notable. Every one of us was happily called to come to Hul, carrying different stories, different life stories concerning reality and post-colonialism from different places. I believe it wouldn't be the same if the festival had happened in Hamburg or in Seoul. Most of us who came to Hue currently are based in cities. However, we could somehow retain better sensibility to talk about the reality and the post-colonial perspectives in Arbeit Center. It was my second time there to a summer festival. Last time it was more like a diversity film workshop with youth. Both of times I got to mingle with and learn from really colorful people coming from different backgrounds. Yes, I said colorful, not to refer to the color of skin per se, but to somehow metaphorically highlight the spectrum in which we are situated. A great thing about colors is that they are expressively so rich and abundant, yet not so clear-cut. It's fluid. Think about watercolor. They get mixed, faded, the clay as well. Colors get mixed, faded, and they're always in a state of becoming. And it's possible to give a name to a color, like hex code. Yet it depends on the materiality on which the color is put. The reality that enables the materiality somehow is very crucial to the manifestation of colors. And I think we need to agree that we just stand on a spectrum without giving a very strict label to each other. I'm like relatively this far away from your opinion, your identity, but it doesn't mean that we belong to different categories. So, in the festival, we have different nationalities. We had different nationalities, gender, cultural, educational trainings, and so much more different things that it's easier to name demarcations that we share. This time we are mostly BPOC who are still carrying the weight of the colonial past. I, for instance, was the only person with East Asian lineage or nationality present in the festival workshop. Better Festival. And however little known it is about South Korean history, I also carry the colonial weight. But I think we all, regardless of nationality or skin color, are carrying the weight of the colonial, patriarchal, heteronormative modernity in some ways. And this podcast is made around this notion or understanding of the invisible, embedded colonial weight. Just accepting that it exists. And the weight I used to overlook personally. And I want to also share the unlearning moments that I had during the festival. The unlearning sometimes comes unexpectedly and overwhelmingly. However, I was definitely helped by the stories, spirituality, and insights shared by the people who made this festival together. I hope this podcast could be a small opportunity for you to imagine the possible space and community that could bring these unlearning and power to you. So, I decided to touch on some of the sessions of the festival. I had intended to cover all the sessions which took place, but in the end I thought it's better to share the learning and the reflection that I feel comfortable with sharing. As the festival comprised multiple sessions with profound emotions and learnings from insights from each creator and curators, I suggest you check them out on the Hülle Medienwerkstatt website. Frankly speaking, it took me quite some time to situate myself and my role in the post-production of this festival. On site, I actually spent a lot of time jotting down all the things that were happening to me or happening in front of me to prepare for this podcast. I did not want to miss out a thing that's happening there. However, this paranoia led me somehow to keep distance from what's happening inside me. The raw, unfiltered emotions and indescribable learnings might have slipped through my fingers, which were busy writing notes for the future. For this. But I'm glad that I did take the notes, after all, because I could share some of the things more vividly to you with the notes. But sometimes I felt like I was there as an observer rather than a participant. I think also because I I think also because I joined the team in the last minute, and I didn't know what was expected from me to do in the festival. However, after giving enough time and thought on the direction of this podcast, I started to realize that it might be only fair to share the impressions and the experience on the personal level, to respect and celebrate the works of the curators and creators who shared their own. Well, aren't we here to decolonize our body and thinking? Yeah, I can only speak for myself when talking about the post-colonial perspectives and the impressions that I got from the festival. If you expected to hear a more, objective, like traditionally journalistic report of the festival, I'm here to say I'm sorry, but I'm not really sorry to disappoint you, because you'll find something still meaningful. I hope you do. I chose the sessions of Hoitzone and Rosa Murtha to discuss the decolonization of sense-making and reflection. And I'll do it in a good old chronological order, because some of my thoughts are very roughly born through the series of interactions and impressions from each session. These thoughts are recursively linked in my head. I will try to depict both sessions so that the ones who did not watch the documentary videos of the festival, or who weren't there, could also picture it and step into my introspective reproduction of the festival. There will be also Rosa Murtha's voice appearing in the end of this podcast, so bear with me for a while. Cutting to the chase, I want to bring up the very first and very powerful performance of the festival, given by Hartzane Moncho, followed by a beautiful conversation with Isaiah Lopez and Hoitze. On the second day of the festival, after having a brief getting to know session last night, we sat down on the floor in a hall with a high ceiling, forming a half-moon shape, and facing the video projected on the wall. It was around noon. Or before noon. Everyone was seated comfortably, yet there was some unspoken tension and anticipation for the very first event of the festival. Some of us were new to the space, some were new to the people, and some were new to the devices. Everyone kept the silence while sitting on the beanbags. The video broke the silence with a masked body in the forest, sometimes hiding behind the trees. One voice cries out, "Rain, rain, if you fall on my mother. Sun, sun, if you shine on my mother." Then someone walked into the hall to us, with a mask and a costume made out of yellowish straws and patterned fabric. She carried a bag of shells, walking around the hall and making beautiful sounds with it. Shattering shells on the floor, barefooted. It felt like the shells were spread out to us, who were sitting on the floor, but shortly after they were swept away. A call was made. Turn and return the stolen lands. My children, my monsters rule the earth. The faces were not shown, not in the video, nor in the bodily presence of the artist. There was only a masked body, caressing and grappling with the nature. And this being was giving and taking back the beautiful shells. It felt like there was an expansion, distribution, and contraction of something. Something that we used to share, something that was bestowed by a bigger existence to us, which is now taken aback. What is the existence? The masked body that sprinkled the shells and took them away. Where did the shells come from in the first place? And where do they go? After the performance came a conversation between Herze, who performed, and Isaiah from the curatorial team. I have to mention that this conversation was very elaborate and carefully thought out, so that it did not break or hinder the astonishment, awe, and awe sinking in. Herze shared the date, localities, and names of her ancestors, situating herself and this performance within the discourse. Then, with her autobiography of the piece, she explained how the poetry of the voiceover and the video was created. Monsters and the darkness, the two keywords of the poetry, were to show how we project human behavior onto all the existences around us, and it was to warn its impetuosity. Herze and Isaiah mentioned that the monstrosity, regarded as the illness of the society, becomes and became a social pretext by which some people or being get separated from others, get alienated from others. I also feel that we tend to ascribe certain human qualities and behavior to everything that is within our reach, and it's a destruction. We grab and take other beings and alienate them from the rest, like we put our brains in the bulletproof cylinder. For this, I will explain it later. As opposed to this, Herze mentioned the poetic journey of becoming healer and being the one who comes to talk things which are not so talked, and the one who argues with the spirit. Whatever casts a light casts a shadow, said Herze. I think the obsession for humanity and the sophistication of this obsession creates this embodiment of ourselves and leaves us with beheaded bodies. We forget that we have bodies that hold memories, bring pleasure and pain, bodies that exist not only to work for someone else. I was asking myself, do we take enough time, effort, and sensitivity to understand the darkness as we strive for the light? Do we take enough time, effort, and sensitivity to understand the darkness? As obsessed we have been with the progress, humanity, and normality, we're ignorant when it comes to the dark side of this whole obsession. When the light is casted, it delineates and fragments the land which had no borders nor contrasts. It pushes away the darkness to occupy the space which was formerly calm and quiet, as if the darkness deserved or knew nothing better. And we pretend that the light discovered something new from the space, suggesting the darkness did not know nor deserve this. Little do we know what the darkness knew and had within its own existence, since the light always creates invisibility by highlighting some and minimizing the rest. Then, when some being rises from the darkness, we make a swift and impetuous move to call it a monster. Now I want to toss you some questions to you who are now tuning into this podcast. On a personal level, what does decolonization mean to you? And how would you decolonize yourself? How would you describe the colonial weight or baggage that you and your surrounding are carrying? I think my colonial baggage and my attempt to tackle it starts with perceptive modalities and language. I know it sounds big, but this is how I tackle an issue which is the thing I want to decolonize. My way of sense-making is quite linear and paranoid. I need to identify the cause and somehow eradicate the cause, like exactly what I'm trying to do right now. Like a scientist in a lab, I would like to identify the cause and control the factors and believe I can predict the following outcome. And believe that it will solve the problem. It's a beheaded colonial rational body, as Goethe said. Nonetheless, since staying in Western Europe for a couple of years, I have felt even this is not rational enough. You know, for some westernized ivory towers. Especially through a couple of lockdowns and burnouts, my thoughts had been much confined in a 30 square meter room of an apartment. I took out my brain to keep it in the cylinder, as if the rationality and reasoning is everything. Like they are the only means to our intelligence and understanding of the world. Trapped in the bulletproof cylinder, my brain could only function in an autistic spiral. And I asked, where do I stand? Wait, what does it mean to have feet on the ground? Why do my thoughts matter to anyone? What is this all for? What is this? And what is this? I was entrapped by the mandates of rationality, objectivity, of the colonial body. Well, now, who is the monster and who's not? After the lunch break, we changed into white clothes. I was wearing a long white cotton shirt flowing around my knees. There was something already magical to see everyone wearing white, standing on the grass of the side garden. However, I couldn't really say my impression out loud, because I was running around here and there to connect my phone to Wi-Fi, to play the background music for Rosa Murtha's ritual. I failed, but the music was successfully playing from someone else's phone, and the altar for the ritual had been ready. I tried to sneak into the people who are already feeling the grass from their feet forming a circle. I tried to switch off my intermediary role of assisting David while filming the session. To be honest, I had grown a bit tired from the last session because I couldn't really let my emotions sink in while trying to write down everything and find everything to put it on the podcast. You know this one. I was racking my brain out to understand what it means to decolonize myself, how to do it, and how to describe it and explain it, and so on. Too much thoughts and emotions, really. The thoughts that I had, that I said in the thoughts that I said on this podcast mostly came to me during this time. They were all hazy and sedimentary. So even when the background music started playing and we were asked to move our body to the rhythm, I was quite reluctant. Wait, before dancing, Rosa Martha gave us an introduction to the gods and the 4 elements and traditional ritualistic process. For this introduction, you can check out the documentary video. I'm sure it will be worth of your time. Anyways, then we started to dance. We were softly interacting and engaging with bodies and spiritual selves. But even by then I was reluctant. When was the last time that I danced under the daylight? And then we were asked to be barefooted. The sun was actually shining brightly over our head, and the sky was high and clear. It was weird that the weather is so different in Hür to Hamburg's weather, which was so windy and cloudy. It was really cold. So feeling the sun and feeling the grass between the toes, I was gradually immersed in the ritual. Standing in circle, we said one thing out loud that we'd like to say to our ancestors. Everyone chose a language that they felt like speaking. I said one sentence in Korean. Actually, I cannot remember now what came to my mind when I chose to say those words to my grandfather, but there was a sense of connectedness. I know it's hard to describe. It's hard to convince, but I could already feel the connectedness. Circulating words and emotions which could not be interpreted. We warmed up our spirituality and our bodies. Then we got dispersed into a small garden surrounding the Abbot's Center to connect with nature. We were strictly asked not to pluck anything, but just to feel and perceive the nature differently. I went straight to the inner corner of the garden, where a huge tree was standing. There were countless fallen branches, scrunching over whenever I moved. At first, the dry branches touched my soul, and the soft and damp moss filled the gaps between my toes. It's hard to describe how it feels to open up the senses. The senses that you didn't even know that you had shut down for so long. And without even really thinking through, I started to feel and touch everything with my lips. It didn't come to me when I was intuitively doing it, that I used to do this when I was little. I would stroke my lips against a soft, old silk pillowcase to feel how softer it has become after spending so much time along my nights. The pillowcase that I loved is now long gone, ripped and thrown away when my mother felt it is no longer necessary for me. I remember I had a hard time swallowing the fact that something that I loved so much could be so simply thrown away. Then I just lived with it and forgot about it. However, was it truly something that's no longer necessary? Was it wrong to feel it with my lips? When you put your lips against something, you put not only the texture, but also the scent closer to yourself. Senses are no longer dominated by visuals, which modern people take no time to process and analyze. I think it opens up the space beyond the cylinder where I put my brain to touch things with my lips. No longer am I bound to the eternal spiral of existential crisis from this colonial body. Lips are the door to one of the warmest and most sensitive organ. You literally take things from your mouth and they become a part of your body. Somehow, ironically, what I'm doing is something that I didn't want to do with this experience, to analyze and give words to it. But now that I think of it, I wish I could have kept my lips against a pillowcase. When we came back to the circle after having individual engagements with the nature, we shared our emotions and teachings that we got from the nature. I could not verbalize it well enough, but I tried to convey that it was a truly freeing and healing experience. I realized how strongly one's close engagement with a tree or nature or sprout can reconnect the reality in one's body. It's like putting the head back onto the body and give the efficacy back to the body. Moreover, I felt much more open to the surrounding, so that I learned that when I thought too much about how we humans could be more understanding to each other and be caring, it is actually interacting with nature that helped me understand something. Interacting with nature more effectively has let me be the person that I would like to be, more humane than just thinking or reading about how to be open-minded. So it is yet again not that linear as I expected. If you are listening to this and feeling the need to open up yourself to another person or to a community, I suggest you interact with nature and give yourself enough time to open up your senses and feel the things around us. Then just try to find a reason or an issue that's directly affecting your attitude towards others. The issue might not be you or the person next to you. There might not be an issue really, but it could be a sign that we need a regenerative time with our bodies and realities beyond the colonial productivity. Like how to take care of ourselves. From Hoyt's performance and Rosa Martha's ritual, I really felt the potential that could mitigate the colonial weight on my body. It is to work on a way in which we open up our sensibility to the nature and spirituality and try to see what's regarded invisible. I should say my visual modality is very much linked with rationality and the Western epistemology that I have internalized throughout the modern education. Because I was brought up to understand the situation and make decisions just by looking at it, for me visuality works with heavily embedded and inscribed logics. I know there might be so many things that I take for granted without thinking for myself. That I would do things differently if I had time or ways to give more thoughts to them. And I felt this time somehow putting back the beheaded head on the body requires the sensation that isn't made in a top-down way. The sensation that is not processed directly or first through the brain. You know, we live in a flood of visual sensations, from Instagram, from films, to all sizes of screens. Then to feel the grass and moss with lips, with your feet, between your toes, puts me in a mindlessness which ironically puts the brain back on my body. This knowledge, sensation, and the openness is so different from the Western concept of enlightenment, if you will, yet so powerful. So, unlearning does not have to be about eradicating the things we learned or had, but to feel and experience that what we learned might not be the only option for us, may not even be the best one. I have to admit that being born and raised in a metropolis, unknowingly, my line of thoughts was much city-oriented. I talked and heard about post-colonialism, decolonialism, in a white room, on Zoom conferences, or even at a bustling pub. But none of them brought my thoughts closer to my here and now, bodily existence with the community of Earth and all the other beings. Being with wonderful people and cows at Arbeit made me realize I had been lacking a huge part when discussing post-colonialism. That's my body. This time I felt my brain, my logic, some verbose expressions and pedantic quotations that I love to copy down. Alone could never be enough without my body when discussing post-colonialism. However, it is quite easy to lose the sense of bodily presence, and also, I should say, a sort of bodily efficacy of oneself, when you're entrapped in the neoliberal rules of cities. Decolonial thinking or unlearning could be thought as means and the end of scooping out the Western power and imposing, and turning to what really we were. However, it is not this linear and simple when I take a look at myself. I want to ask you before ending, how can we unlearn and devise an alternative without using the same old positivist and binary way of approach? The festival gave me a good and timely opportunity to reflect on my actions and interactions with the surroundings, especially on mundane, micro-local level of my movement. No body is detached from other bodies, and no time passes alone enough to extinguish all the fires. I always occupy some space and time in a certain locality that is yet again connected to other bodies, history, and future. However, I often forget that I am not only some result or a byproduct of bigger system, but also a body with flesh and bone, that I have 2 feet grounded on this world, no matter what the situation is, and that I could feel differently and act differently as long as I have my body and some people around me to remind me to see the invisibles, to feel the invisibles. I'm still asking myself, where do I belong and how I should stand on this ground? How should I stand on this ground? How should I understand the past and grapple with the present? However, I now better accept that these are important questions, but not the ones that I need to have an answer right now. And even if I feel lost while working on these questions, I would know that there are some other important ways to tackle my own colonial weight. But also self-care. I want to recite one poem before closing this podcast. I hope you're all safe and sound and you have a warm community around you that you could share your emotions and warmth with. 2021 has been a really tough year, and it's still tough. However, I hope you'll have rest and space to take care of yourself. Oh, and there will be 2 more parts. My questions to Rose and Martha, and the answers. And a conversation with curators, Alexis and Mohammed. I hope you also check them out if you're interested, and also please do go and check out the video documentation, and don't hesitate to write us if you want to share something with us. Pioneers by Leonard Cohen from Let Us Compare Mythologies. Pioneers. After one furious year, you thought you could come back with singing armies to cheer the landscape and startle old streams. But someone's bulldozers had heaved the river aside, and the fish screamed against fossils in the drying sand. Because you learned some family lives in faces and let go gratefully the easy silhouettes. Did you believe the treacherous dead year could go quiet and unmourned and leave no time for gasping and for breath? So roar with your comrades in the staggering mountains, or weep with them at high views of colored water. But nourish the tired saplings with your marking axe, and if your swing draws blood, dig deeper, and the autumn path will not seem so intricate. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll check out the other episodes and also the video documentation.